Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Michelle Singer from the Kellogg-Hubbard Library. I'm here to welcome you tonight to the Climate Change Speaker Series with the League of Women Voters. The library has partnered with the League of Women Voters for the past 7 years to present this speaker series, and we're so glad to have you all with us this evening. I would like to remind you to please stay muted for the program. That way we can hear our panelists clearly. We are recording this program, and it will be available on the Kellogg-Hubbard Library's YouTube channel as well as our website. So if you know someone who wanted to be here but couldn't, you're welcome to send them there. I'll put a link into the chat so that you know where that is, and you can let people know where they can watch it. We are going to be taking questions in the chat. So we are not inviting people to unmute and ask questions, but we would very much like for you to ask questions in the chat. If you're not familiar with the chat, if you hover over the menu at the bottom, there's a little word bubble icon that says chat. If you press on that, it opens up a dialog box, and please put your questions in there. And Jared Duval, our moderator, will be pitching those questions to the panelists. Again, I'm welcome. Kate Rader is going to do our introductions to get us started from the League of Women Voters.
Good afternoon, evening. I'm glad to see you here. Our first 3 programs in the series dealt with the impact of climate change on individuals and on agriculture and nature, and the various social injustices that impacted some groups more than others. Tonight, we're going to the legislature to find out what they have done, what the results of that, and what they hope to do. Our moderator tonight is Jared Duval. He serves as Executive Director of Energy Action Network, a nonprofit organization that conducts energy research and analysis for Vermont. He was appointed the Vermont Climate Council to provide expertise in energy data and analysis. On the council, he co-chairs the Science and Data Subcommittee and also serves on the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee and Council Steering Committee. Jared is the author of Vermont's Climate Action Plan and a frequent witness in this Vermont legislature. He lives in Montpelier with his wife, Reverend Joan Javier Duval, and their 9-year-old son. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jared.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for joining this evening. It's wonderful to see so many faces. And thank you again to Michelle and Kellogg-Hubbard Library and to the League of Women Voters for putting on this event. I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing the 2 panelists for this evening, Senator Andrew Perchilik and Representative Gabrielle Stebbens, who I will share both of their short version of each of their bios in just a minute. But before I do that, I just want to say that I feel like we are really lucky this evening to have the 2 of them joining us, especially in the midst of a very busy legislative session. They are 2 of the most knowledgeable and committed climate leaders in the entire state. So it's great to have them with us. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them so folks are familiar with them. And then I've been asked to do a very short kind of context setting kind of background on the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Vermont Climate Council, kind of where we stand on some of those things. And then we'll turn it over to our panelists to give some updates on some of the legislative priorities in the Vermont legislature this year. So first, let me introduce Senator Andrew Perchilik. He has been active in the Marshfield community, serving on the Energy Committee, the Volunteer Fire Department, and on the Select Board, including a term as chair. He was elected to the Vermont State Senate in 2018 and re-elected in 2020 and 2022. He has served on the Transportation Committee in the Senate and is again this year, including a term as vice chair. And first 2 terms in the Senate, he served on the Education Committee, but this year was appointed to the Appropriations Committee, where he is now vice chair. When not in the legislature, Senator Perchilik is the director of the Clean Energy Development Fund at the Public Service Department, a position he has held since 2010 and he lives in Marshfield, where he and his wife have raised their 3 children. And then we will hear from Representative Gabrielle Stebbens. Born in Newton, Massachusetts, Gabrielle studied at Rice University in Texas. She received 2 degrees there, classical violin and anthropology, and then followed by her master's degree in development policy from the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. In her wide-ranging career, Representative Stebbens has been a park ranger, a river restoration manager, a community organizer, an energy efficiency program coordinator, and executive director of Vermont's Renewable Energy Trade Association. When not serving in the legislature, Representative Stebbens works as a managing consultant at the Heinsberg-based Energy Futures Group, and she has served or is serving on a variety of boards, including as chair of the Burlington Electric Commission, which she served on through 2022, policy member for the American Public Power Association, an advisory board member for the Energy Action Network, and she co-chairs the Vermont General Assembly's Climate Solutions Caucus and the Vermont Climate Workforce Network Action Group. She lives in the south end of Burlington with her husband and 2 young daughters and their fantastic mutt Lola. So now you have a sense of who you will hear from in just a couple of minutes. I am going to go, before we turn it over to our panelists in the legislature, I'm going to just set a little bit of context. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And can folks see that? Thumbs up. I'm seeing nodding. Yep. Thank you. Okay, so just for some background, in 2020, the Vermont legislature passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that became law in 2020. And part of what that law did was to then create the Vermont Climate Council, which is composed of 23 members. And what the Global Warming Solutions Act required the council to do was to craft a climate action plan for Vermont that could meet both the requirements when it comes to emissions reduction, climate pollution reduction, and the goals when it comes to a whole other host of climate related goals, dealing from everything from resilience to adaptation. The Climate Council and its 5 subcommittees worked on drafting that plan for over a year. And that plan was adopted on December 1st, 2021. So as some of you know, the organization that I work for, the Energy Action Network, produces every year an annual progress report for Vermont on emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. And so that just came out this past fall. And one of the things that we do is track progress towards the commitments that Vermont has made as a state, including those commitments in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so here are some of the key findings from that report: that with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, we now have legally binding greenhouse gas reduction requirements. They are not goals. They were previously goals and we missed them year after year. But now we have an obligation to actually reduce pollution in line with the scientific consensus of what needs to happen to avoid the most dangerous impacts from climate destabilization. Our report showed that we are not on track to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements for 2030. And the primary reason for that is that Vermont has not passed the policies as recommended by the Climate Council that could give us the confidence that we would be on track. There were other findings in the report that meeting those obligations in the Global Warming Solutions Act as proposed by the Climate Action Plan could save Vermonters. The economic analysis was $6.4 billion in net savings and avoided damages by 2050. And then the other context here is that in Vermont, nearly 3/4 of our climate pollution comes from our transportation and thermal sectors, mostly how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. And yet we have currently no sector-wide policies to reduce emissions from all the fossil fuel use in those two sectors, like we do with the electricity sector. This graph shows Vermont's historic emissions, or historical emissions, I should say. That's in the darker colors, the brighter, more vibrant colors. And then the more kind of muted colors show if each sector reduces its emissions proportionally, how those that pollution would decline out to 2025, that first green dot, out to 2030, that second green dot, and out to 2050, that third green dot. Those are the 3 years where we have emissions reduction requirements as established in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So that you can see that we have a lot of work to do, and the curve only gets steeper between 2025 and 2030. So next, I will just show the Vermont Climate Council just submitted a report to the legislature. It was kind of a status report, and it included in it a check-in about where we stand on the 3 most significant policy recommendations that the Climate Council made in the Climate Action Plan in terms of when it comes to emissions reduction. There were other very important recommendations around resilience and adaptation, but focusing on pollution reduction and doing our part there, the 3 primary policy recommendations in terms of achieving double-digit emissions reduction by 2030 were a clean heat standard, advancing the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks rules, and joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. And you can see the status there. We've got 1 yellow light, 1 green light, and 1 current red light. And that is that the clean heat standard did not pass last year. It was vetoed by the governor and came up 1 vote short of an override. That bill became the foundation for an updated and expanded bill that is now called the Affordable Heat Act, S5, that Senator Perchilik will talk about. The Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks rules were a massive step forward. They were adopted this year, or sorry, at the end of last year, joining California and a number of other states in increasing the amount of zero emissions vehicles that will come to Vermont and requiring that all vehicles purchased and registered in the state of Vermont as of 2035 have to be zero emission vehicles. And then the Transportation and Climate Initiative program is currently stalled. So that's the kind of status check on the 3 biggest pollution reduction policy recommendations. And then I would just note, I think that Michelle may have put in the chat, for folks who want to see this report, there's a lot more information there. There is a link to our website. You can find it at eanvt.org. But hopefully that was a good, a brief bit of context setting. And now I want to turn it over to Senator Perchilik to speak about some of the policy priorities that he is focused on and that others in the legislature are focused on, especially when it comes to the thermal sector and the electricity sector. Senator Perchilik, over to you.
Thanks, Jared. That was great. And I'll try to keep it brief so we can have more of an open discussion about it and get to people's questions. But yeah, I'll talk about thermal sector of our energy portfolio and the electric sector, and then Representative Stebbens is going to talk about the other stuff, transportation and some other things. So as Jared mentioned, there's the Affordable Heat Act this year. It's built on the work that was done on the clean heat standard that it was in one of the slides there from last year's. It's S5 is the number. It's in the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee being worked on. You all in Washington County have Senator Ann Watson, your new senator, that's in that committee. She's the vice chair. And they've been working on this basically every day since the session started. I think they're hoping to get it out in the next couple of weeks. It'll have to go to 1 or 2 other committees and then over to the House. I really like the new focus on the affordable heat. That's kind of the main thing for me, why I'm interested in this. Ever since I've been in Vermont, I've worked on some kind of energy program. I started doing heating assistance as a Vista volunteer and working with different CAP agencies in the state on how we can help people with their heating bills. And then every few years there's a crisis when heating oil goes up, and we complain about the fact that people can't afford to heat their homes and are having to choose between buying food and paying their fuel bill. But then, the prices kind of go back to normal and we forget about it. We really haven't addressed the fundamental issue that we're over-reliant, addicted to imported fossil fuels. And these imported fossil fuels are not good for us, not good for the planet, not good for us economically, and not good for us environmentally. So this bill is I think finally trying to address it in a systematic way. Other times it's been, how do we get more money for LIHEAP? How can we just help low income folks with their fuel bills, which I think is great, and we need to do that. But if we switch to our own local renewable energy and do much more energy efficiency and weatherization, that's the real way to make it affordable and support our local economy, provide jobs, support the forest products industry, keep forests as forests, make homes more comfortable by doing the weatherization and energy efficiency work that we need to do. So that's the kind of the overall part. I can get into the specifics, but I think one important thing to remember about the bill is it's really just setting up this framework. It's kind of saying what I just said, that this is an important part to help Vermonters have clean, affordable heat going forward, in the next, decades. And we have to set up a whole system to do that and work with our fuel dealers to do that. So it sends it over to the PUC that regulates now all the electric utilities and the few other utilities we have, and have them set this up. And then they're going to do a report and, study, come back next year. The legislature will look at that. The PUC will do a rule. They'll come back the next year. We'll look at that. And it's won't go into effect until 2026. So there's still a lot of work to be done. This bill just really sets us up on a path to get that work done and design a program that is good for our economy, is good for low-income Vermonters, does help our environment and meets our goals. And if we can't do it, then there's opportunities to fix it and change it over the next couple of years as we have reports back to the legislature. So that's that part. And like I said, we can talk more about details or what people think. I know there's some people out there that are worried that it's just going to raise fuel prices, but there's many different options and many ways to make this affordable. Focus on the lowest income people, focus on the sectors that help Vermont the most, which are, like, for example, I really think focusing on advanced wood heating is good for Vermont. There's some places where heat pumps will make more sense, or where we just do weatherization and efficiency, but there are other places where wood heating will make sense. And that's by taking this approach of all these different thermal energy sources is the way to make it affordable and clean and as an economic benefit to the state. So that's the clean heat standard. As I said, starting in the Senate, we'll go over to the House. We're also hoping to make progress on our electric front, because one of the main ways that we can clean up our thermal sector is by switching to electricity, because we've done a really good job in Vermont in switching our electricity to a more renewable energy grid. And this includes imports that we get from Canada and other wind farms around the region and other hydro from around the region. And so we have a very clean grid. We have electric rules that we started in 2005 with what was called SPEED at the time. And then in 2015, we created a renewable energy standard that said the utilities had to get up to 75% renewable energy by 2032. But the utilities are saying, hey, we could get there, we could get to 100% by 2032. So we want to get there. And if we're going to use more electricity for our heating and transportation, as Representative Stebbens will talk about, I think, then we want to have that electricity as clean, renewable, and in my view, as local as we can. And so we're looking at trying to update that renewable energy standard that passed in 2015 to 100% renewable energy standard. That bill hasn't started yet, so because there's a lot of questions about how much of the electricity should be local, how much should be imported. You know, do we want to include different resources as equal, like is wind the same as Hydro-Quebec, and is solar the same as a wood-powered plant? So those are the discussions that will help in that, but that'll help us to get to 100% renewable energy grid that'll make our heating and transportation use of electricity all that more green and more beneficial to our economy. So that's my spiel on those two sectors, and I'll pass it on to Representative Stebbens to talk about other things, and then we can take questions.
Thanks, Senator Perchilik and Jared, and good evening, everyone. I am going to do the opposite of Senator Perchilik, and I'm going to let you know about a whole bunch of, I got the talk about all the other bills category. So I'll start with transportation. For the last 3 years, there has been sort of an overarching climate-related transportation bill that representatives have worked on. This year, it was called the Transportation Affordability Act, and it's like 48 pages. But some of the highlights that I'll mention here, obviously we're proposing, more incentives, more grant funding for bicycle and pedestrian mobility grants. We're proposing ongoing support for 2 really unique and important programs. One is called Replace Your Ride. One is called Mileage Smart. They're both focused on low to moderate income Vermonters, helping them either purchase their first vehicle or to upgrade to a much more efficient vehicle. We have language in there for $10 million in grants. This is one of my favorite. It's called the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program. We all know Vermont is a rural state, and so companies like Uber or Lyft, while perhaps they might be in Burlington, are not necessarily interested in going to other places in Vermont. Because there just isn't the market demand. There isn't the, the number of customers to allow for that market structure, that business structure, to provide the profit margin that would be necessary for that type of a company. So what the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program has done is work with local communities via a grant program process to essentially set up little mini rural Ubers. So, identifying some of the most important rides and when those might need to occur. So in Montpelier, where there is one of these programs, it goes from downtown Montpelier to the hospital at specific times of days. Specific times you can essentially go onto an application and say, I need a ride at this time. And so those are some of the types of really creative out of the box thinking that excites me, given that public transit, which is historically far more successful in highly populated, dense locations, that we need to be more flexible and more creative to figure out unique solutions for Vermont. Some other items in the Transportation Affordability Act is a requirement to really look into complete streets. This means that whereas in 1950, 60, 70, 80, 1990, even maybe 2000, a lot of our planning, a lot of our larger infrastructure planning is really designed not for humans, it's designed for the automobile. And what does that mean in terms of crossing the street in your town? If the main road in your town is a state road and someone's going 55 and they don't see the slow down sign, and someone's trying to cross the street from, town hall to the public library. How do we rethink? How do we redesign our larger planning processes and our mapping and our engineering design plans to really think not about the automobile solely, but with bicyclists, pedestrians, and other types of mobility on an equal footing. That's obviously not always an opportunity. I mean, we have plenty of roads that abut river edges, and we're not proposing to put on, you know, an additional 8-foot sidewalk so that people can walk around that particular area. But really to sort of change how we think about planning. And then we have some Amtrak extension proposals in the Transportation Affordability Act, as well as some language about zero fare and looking at how to provide public transit free for those who really can't afford it otherwise. Some other bills that we're talking about, I did see in the chat some information or some questions about whether or not we can look at design and structure of buildings. We are likely to see another bill with regards to building energy code. I believe it's in the drafting stage right now. Vermont has been at the forefront in terms of developing our building energy code and increasing it, but we don't have a lot of enforcement. And so what we're seeing is that our compliance rates have been dropping over the last decade from somewhere in the 75% compliance to, I think at this point, it's like 54 or 55, maybe 56%. But what that means is that every other home, every other residential home that's being built right now is not, you know, as efficient as it could be, and not as just building energy code smart as it could be. So there will be a bill proposed that says, hey, we've got to pull together the many players that work on this type of area, from developers to the public service department to the public safety department, you name it, to figure out how we might design a program and a structure that is right-sized for Vermont. Obviously, having enforcement for every building in Vermont is not a feasible option, to have someone go into every location. So how do you design something that makes sense? We also have a bill that's being worked on with regards to climate workforce. As Jared mentioned, I'm one of the co-chairs for actually Energy Action Network staff, of which Jared is the executive director. That nonprofit sort of leads the background nuts and bolts work for this climate workforce initiative. It's a statewide initiative, and it recognizes the fact that if we're going to reach our required emissions mandates, and frankly, if we're going to make it affordable for Vermonters to heat their homes and get from A to B, then we need to have people who are going to be installing whatever we're talking about, if it's a heat pump, or if it's solar, or if it's a pellet heating system, and also providing weatherization. We're going to have workers who are trained to do that, and able to provide those services. So there will be a bill, or rather there are bills being discussed related to that. What's really exciting about that is that it provides an opportunity for really good paying jobs that don't require college degrees, master's degrees, and you know, the more that we have those jobs here, doing that work here, so that people are saving money on energy, the more that we have just a circular economy in terms of the dollars spent here in this state. As many of you guys might remember, we have an Inflation Reduction Act that was passed. This act at the federal level provides quite a bit of many millions and millions of dollars of various types of opportunities for things like weatherization, heat pumps, upgrading your electric panels, and so on. The thing is, you have to know how to access those dollars. The regs at the federal level are still being developed. However, we do have a treasurer with Treasurer Mike Pichak, who's really keeping an eye on this. And we have a newly formed Vermont Public Finance Climate Collaborative. This is a partnership between Vermont Economic Development Authority, or agency, authority, I think. This is an entity that provides loans to businesses, farms, and the like. We also have VHFA, Vermont Housing Finance Authority or Agency. I should really find out what these A's mean. And they provide loans to lower and moderate income Vermonters for home purchases, etc. And then we have the Vermont Bond Bank, which provides loans for municipalities and towns. And these three entities pretty much can offer loans for the types of programs that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act dollars, are supposed to be able to provide support for. So we do have a bill that is proposing to bring all of these efforts under one umbrella so that we really don't leave those federal dollar opportunities off the table. And we make sure that we're able to harness them as much as possible, regardless of whether you're a business, a homeowner, or a town or a city. A few more, and then I will stop. Currently, in the Environment and Energy Committee, which I sit on, we are taking testimony on 30 by 30, which is basically a plan to look at Vermont writ large from a science-based approach called Vermont Conservation Design to identify areas of Vermont that should be prioritized for permanent preservation. And preservation in this bill currently has three different categories. One is never touch it ever. One is more of an active management to help it grow older. And another is active management, but in a way that allows for sustainable forestry practices. So for paper products, etc. I mention this because we often talk about climate initiatives with regards to weatherization, with how we use energy, transportation, how we heat our homes or electricity, but really it also relates to land use development. And we know that we have housing, really strong housing challenges. So how are we going to make sure that Vermont meets the housing needs that we have, but in a way that doesn't simply just allow for sprawl? And so that's where this bill comes into play. And how do we really balance some of the things that we love about Vermont, our rural nature, our gorgeous forests, of which like 78% are privately owned? How do we balance those pieces? And I think I have one more, and then I will stop. There is also a bill called actually, I don't really know if it has a name yet. Basically, it would allow for the Public Utility Commission, which is the quasi-judicial entity that oversees our electric utilities and other entities that have a monopoly. It gives that Public Utility Commission jurisdiction over the construction and operation of essentially thermal energy networks. So if any of you have looked into Iceland, a lot of Iceland is heated by underground shared geothermal networks. So again, as we're thinking about housing, if, you know, I live in Chittenden County, we do have a fair number of these 40-unit single homes that go up. If we actually, at the upfront planning stages, thought about, you know, an underground heating network source at the upfront, how can we so much more efficiently, effectively, and comfortably build homes and entire little communities in a way that's as efficient and as clean as possible? So that bill is trying to open the opportunity for more of that type of thinking and problem solving and projects for current and future housing. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Representative Stebbens. I know that there have been a number of questions and comments being put in the chat throughout. If you have a question that hasn't been posted yet, please go ahead and add it as we go. There were a couple
Jared,
of
can I
questions.
add one more? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Please go ahead.
There is a bill both in the House and the Senate related to having the Vermont Pension Investment Commission, VPIC, develop a plan to divest from companies from companies that are 50% or more invested in fossil fuel in one way or another, to divest from those companies by December 31st, 2030. So the first step is a plan to figure this out. And the second step is to implement it. And, you know, interestingly, a lot of the companies that have historically or are still fossil fuel based are some of the companies starting to shift towards renewables. I highlight this because it poses some of the questions as to how, where, when do you divest in a way that is careful with people's retirement funds, but also preparing for when the market writ large is shifting away from fossil fuels. So how do we do that in a way that is thoughtful, strategic, pragmatic, but also, you know, not leaving it to never be achieved? Now I'll stop.
Thank you, Representative Stebbins. Thank you, Senator Perchilik. So again, please feel free to add additional questions in the chat. There have been a bunch. I'm going to start with one up front, which is a very broad question that I want to pose to both of you, which is, you've covered a lot of the what in terms of the policy priorities, what bills are have been introduced, are likely to be introduced, and some of the policy substance and intent. I'm wondering if you can step back and speak a little bit to the how of the policymaking process. Like, for all of these folks who are gathered here who really care about these issues, want to see progress and maybe in different directions. I'm sure there's disagreement. We're seeing some of that in the chat. But what, from your seat as legislative leaders, what can you share about what we should know about the policymaking process and kind of the how of how these policy priorities get developed and advanced, that would be helpful for folks who care about them and want to, you know, influence their path to know about?
So I'm happy to go first, and then if you want to go next, Andy. With a part-time seasonal citizen legislature, the bills that move are bills that have support both internally as well as externally. For example, the bill I mentioned about the geothermal energy networks, that is actually a bill that I believe someone participating and listening in right now here, you know, proposed and said, why isn't Vermont doing this? So I really find that the bills that, I mean, I think last biennium we had 500 or 600 bills proposed at a minimum on the House side. The bills that really gain traction are usually the ones that have, you know, external Vermonter support. And also they do take time. You know, the first time I heard about a renewable portfolio standard was a study, I think, in 2006. And then there were probably 3 or 4 bills that were proposed about that. And finally, one was passed in 2015. So I'd say we're incredibly fortunate and unique to be in a state where you literally can just walk into your state house and ask for time with your representatives and your senators, and to get involved and start to ask questions about why we aren't doing something, or why we're doing something this way and not that way. Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from the most successful policy does not start with one legislator cooking up an idea. It starts with multiple people working on something, typically outside of the State House. And no matter what, when it gets to the State House and testimony starts, issues arise, nothing's ever fully baked, but to have some of that initial core where do we agree? Where do we not agree? What is our end goal? To have that work happen, before a bill even is drafted is incredibly valuable.
Senator Perchilik, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I just would just to be specific about how it works. It's the committee members that first get the bill that really do the work on it and that listen to the testimony and have been experts and citizens and state government folks that are in the subject area. And so those, which could be as small as 4 people in some committees, 5 people in the Senate to 11 or 12 or more in the House, those people will decide whether that bill gets changed, whether it passes, how they work on it, how they take advice, how they deal with conflicts, or not, and then decide the bill is not going to pass. And then, most people know that it goes through various committees and then has to get voted by both full bodies, and through the governor. But there's a lot of people. I think sometimes people think it is just the 5 people in the room that are voting on a bill, that would be in the Senate. But there really is a lot of input from a lot of witnesses, from citizens to experts to the government entities that might have to work on the bill, work on the law once it becomes a law. And sometimes the law is different than policy, but I assume the question was more about the laws like this. The clean heat standards I talked about the law isn't a policy. I'd say the policy is kind of being set by the PUC in the law, then coming back, and we'll look at that policy that they developed. If that makes sense.
Thanks. So that actually can take us to one of the I think it was the very first question that was posed, which was, somebody commenting about a possible concern that I don't know who they were quoting, but the quote in the question was, "Too much, too fast, too expensive for many." I think that this was in relation to somebody's assessment or concern about the Affordable Heat Act. Can you address that criticism of too much, too fast, and how do you see it?
I'll go first this time. Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what specifically they're talking about. I'm guessing they're talking about the Affordable Heat Act. It's we talked about it last year, went through both bodies and a veto of the governor. It's things like this have been talked about in the Climate Council as Jared's presentation started beginning. We've talked about other ways to address this issue for decades and decades. So I would say the issue is not new, and it's not. I would not say it's happening fast. It's not going to happen until 2026 is when it would actually come into play. So there'd be plenty of time to kind of prepare for it. And I think for folks that are, let's say you're heating with kerosene, price of kerosene went up 90%. If that was me, I'd say, like, why isn't the government working faster to find a way to lower my heating bill? What are we doing to lower people's over reliance on fossil fuels? That's something that we need to work on faster to make it more affordable. I don't know what the comment is about too expensive. We don't know what the expenses are of these things. I think at least my goal with all of them is to make things cheaper.
Representative Stebbens, is there anything that you'd like to say about that, or I can go? I'm happy to go on to the next question. Although I think it was directed to you, Senator Perchilik, although you both may want to comment on it. And that was from Michael Dwayne. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Michael. And it says, can you kindly comment on the effect of the Affordable Heat Act or Clean Heat Standard on loggers, logging, burning wood, and wood-fired electricity?
Well, wood-fired electricity wouldn't be part of it because it's about heating fuel. So other than the electricity, grid and feeding the electric heating appliances like heat pumps. So it'd be related that way. So the bill requires all the different heating sources to be basically scored on their greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact that some of our electricity comes from wood will be impact the score that a heat pump, for example, would get. So that's it. Like electricity, I think it'll be good for our forests, because I believe that we need to have a working forest to keep the forests as forests, and those that are, working in the state to protect our forests, often say this. Commissioner Snyder, who was a forester by training, he went into forestry because he loved trees and keeping forests, and worked for something like the last 20 years doing that work, often said that we need to have a working landscape to keep our forests as forests. And I think that's key. And I think it's also very important to keep the whole of Vermont supportive of this. We could do it without it. It's not that it's impossible, but I think if we really want to have all of Vermont working together on this, I think wood heating is an important part of it. That does release carbon. We have to be, very upfront about that. But I think because it's cheaper than a lot of other resources, and because it's local and it can support the local forest economy, I think that's critical to bringing a lot of Vermonters on board with the policy. And there's why I say advanced wood heating, it's going to be cleaner and more efficient. So there's a lot of people burning wood now. And so if we could just do wood stove changed outs, they can burn less wood. So that would be less emissions, and they would be more comfortable, and we would burn less wood, and they could be less likely to switch to oil. So I think it would be good for Vermont and for the part of our economy that is reliant on the forest. So we're losing forests to development, not to logging.
Thank you, Senator Perchilik. Representative Stebbins, is there anything that you would like to add or comment on that? Or
Yeah, I'll just go back to the fact that, like, I wish I knew my statistic. I've heard so many statistics today. Between 70 to 80% of Vermont is, and our forests is privately owned. So, we heard testimony in the Environment and Energy Committee. We're hearing testimony on biodiversity, on, requiring or developing a plan so that 30% of our forests are permanently preserved in one way or another by 2030, and that 50 is preserved by 2050. Then later on in the same day, we're taking testimony about broadband, because we've all learned during COVID how important it has been for people, particularly people working from home, kids who had to learn at home, how important it is to have broadband and high speed internet. And so we heard testimony about how the broadband rollout is occurring, and we have a phenomenal network of volunteers developing CUDs. I'm forgetting what the C is. Communication union districts. And essentially these volunteers are figuring out how to get broadband to the rural parts of Vermont, just like Uber doesn't want to go to the rural parts of Vermont. The larger companies that provide fiber and broadband, you lose money if you're hitting 3 houses in a 20-mile section. I'll get to my point. I'm getting there. I learned that right now, broadband, the plan is to really reach, every property that exists. When asked, what do you do if you get your broadband to, 5 miles up the mountain ridge. And then by doing that, you know, the next person sells their forest or their mountain acreage, whatever. And so the next person develops a house the next 5 miles up. Well, broadband has to serve wherever electricity is serving. So you have a private landowner, 70–80% of Vermont, privately owned, gradually selling property. Bit by bit, we have electricity purchased and installed, and then broadband has to go in. And then you know, the balancing act here is just incredibly challenging, between how to meet what Vermonters say we want and need, within the resources that we have. And finally, recognizing that 70–80% of Vermont is privately owned. And the process to figuring out how to preserve that, how to make sure that it's economically viable for someone owning large tracts of land, to keep it as large tracts of land for biodiversity, for hunting, for fishing, or for forestry practices. Those are incredibly real challenges. And I would argue that if anyone is presenting something as black or white, then there's a big part of the conversation that isn't being considered, because none of this is black and white. None of this is really either or. It's really challenging.
Thank you, Representative Stebbens. There's a question, there's a lot of comments in the chat, and I'm assuming that folks can just read those, but if there are questions, please add them. One of the next questions I'm seeing is about greenhouse gas emissions accounting in Vermont. They're related to consumption-based accounting versus in-boundary or territorial-based reporting. I would note that as somebody who's very familiar with the way that Vermont does greenhouse gas inventories, and also with consumption-based inventories in other states and life cycle accounting and other programs, I believe that the numbers that are being quoted are not accurate, but I would offer that for folks who are interested in learning more about the differences between different types of emissions inventories and emissions accounting, there's a really good overview on page 16 of the Energy Action Network annual progress report, and it shows an example from Minnesota. That's one of there's only 2 states, Minnesota and Oregon, that have both done in-boundary inventories and consumption-based inventories. And in the Minnesota example, actually their emissions in their in-boundary inventory were higher than when they did a consumption-based inventory. So whether emissions are higher in one inventory methodology or the other depend on the kind of net of exports and imports into an economy. And since we haven't done a consumption-based inventory in Vermont, we can't comment, we can't know how those numbers would compare. What I will say, and just on behalf of, as co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee of the Council, is that the way that Vermont does its greenhouse gas inventory, looking at emissions from within our borders, is consistent with the way that every other state, province, and country, even Oregon and Minnesota, where they do consumption-based inventories, they are supplemental inventories. They are not the official inventory, because we don't want to be double counting emissions that happen in one place and another. But there's more information there if folks want to check that out on page 16 of the EAN annual progress report of different ways of doing emissions inventories. There was a question about the bottle bill. I think you gave an update on that in the chat, Gabrielle, but for folks who didn't see that, do you want to just give a brief update about the bottle bill?
I'll give as much as I can, which is we just started taking testimony in the last couple of days on the bottle bill. In summary, the bottle bill was first developed in 1973, and we haven't done anything to it really since then, which is a long time. It's actually older than me. but you know, it's a long time to have a bill that is still saying 5 cents a bottle. You know, it's interesting also that the bottle bill was originally presented as a litter reduction bill. It was to try and get people to stop throwing the open beer can out their car as they drove, because we used to have that being legal back in 1973. As a result, because it is so old, there are a whole lot of interesting sort of disconnects. We have some plastic bottles that you know, do have a 5 cent deposit. Meanwhile, a plastic water bottle doesn't. We have 15 cents on a variety of liquor bottles, but nothing on wine. I've been learning a lot about what actually is easily recyclable and versus reusable. And one of the key things to keep in mind is that, in particular, glass is just far more valuable as a reused product as opposed to grinding it up. And so one of the things that I'm personally really interested in is how do we actually capture that? Because it's the amount of wine bottles and glass that, if we collect it and it's not contaminated with either fine residues or whatnot, it can be sold for like anywhere from $40 to $80 to $100 a ton. Whereas if it's all ground up, it's much more challenging to actually use in a beneficial way. It is possible for like construction materials. Anyway, so a lot of details there. We will probably listen to it some more tomorrow. If you want to take a look at the Environment and Energy Committee website, you can see when that bill comes up. I don't know if you guys have ever, if you go to the Vermont legislative, if you just Google Vermont legislature, there is a search tab. You can search very easily by bill, by legislator. And you can find, you know, a variety. If you go to Environment and Energy, you'll see a list of all the bills that are that have been proposed, and you can find the bottle bill that way, and then look at an agenda to listen in if you're interested. But in terms of logistics, one of the things we haven't talked about, and I don't know how many people here know about it, but there's this thing called crossover week, which means that if a bill starts in the House, by a week in March, if it doesn't get out of the House and over to the Senate, then it won't really have a shot this year, so 2023, and vice versa. If a bill starts in the Senate and it doesn't get over to the House, voted out of the Senate by that week in March, then it will not, it can't actually become a law in 2023. It could next year because it's a 2-year biennium. I mention that because it sets forth a bit of a timing consideration in terms of how many bills a committee can get out in terms of that March week.
Thanks, Representative Stebbins. So I want to move now to a question just to cover multiple sectors. And actually, this is kind of a cross-sector question, and there's so much in the chat that I'm going to try to paraphrase because I can't. There was a question, a good question from Dan Jones about, you know, a lot of what we're talking about on the policy front is reducing emissions through moving away from fossil fuels towards being able to use cleaner and lower emitting electricity. But of course, as we do that, that also increases demand for electricity. So can you speak to, you know, as policymakers, as you look ahead to forecasted increases in electricity demand and needed generation to meet those increased electric loads as we electrify transportation and heating, what does that look like? What are some of the key issues? Are there kind of policy conversations with regard to that? How do you assess that need and that kind of timeline and process?
I'd say one thing that I'm thinking more about is how we can level out our peaks, because it's our peak electric use that really creates the most fossil fuels to be burned and the most, greenhouse gases. If you're also, looking at the wood plants, especially when the prices were lower, the wood plants were only running when there was really peak demand, because that raises prices. So the more we can have controllable loads and the more we can have more broadband so that folks can have more controllable loads throughout the state, I think that's going to be a key way to increase our use of electricity without increasing our use of fossil fuels. I don't know if people, I know there's some energy people on here, but like if you looked at the ISO fuel mixes, during that cold snap, we were using coal, we were using a lot of oil. I think oil got up to 30% of our grid. And so if you're using a heat pump, then you're going to be burning a lot of fossil fuels to keep your house warm during those really peak times. So I think storage of thermal storage and electric storage, I think, are going to be really kind of key issues. I think a key debate is going to be, as we use more electricity for both thermal and transportation, where are we going to get it from? And how much do we want that to be local, and how much do we want it to be within the ISO control area, meaning, New England, basically. And we could get a lot of power from Hydro-Quebec, but there's questions like how much do we want to do that, and how much do we want to rely on upstate New York for wind and hydro and things like that. Those are the issues that I'm thinking about the most, if that answers the question.
Representative Stebbins, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'll build off of it. Senator Perchilik mentioned storage. One of the things we passed 2 years ago was a requirement for all utilities to offer, if their customers wanted it, an electric vehicle time of use rate. So besides storage, it's also about figuring out how to use electricity as efficiently as possible when it's needed. There are folks here who are familiar with energy. There are also probably maybe some folks who aren't. And so to the degree that we can sort of say, okay, hey, electric vehicle, I know you're plugged in to charge right now, but right now there's a huge demand for electricity for heating. So we're going to cut you off via your electric vehicle time of use rate. We're going to cut you off and save that electricity for other higher priorities right now. The more that we start to use sort of the jargon is demand response programs, the more that we start to use those types of program design, electric policy design, so that we're really sort of pushing and pulling the electrons where and how you need them. The more that we do that as real time and as effectively as possible, on top of storage, on top of just conservation and efficiency, that is how we can like winnow down that peak. And it makes a huge difference in terms of cost for Vermonters. We we pay into the overall regional transmission system based off of what our peak is for the state. And so what that means is, even if we don't need any transmission projects, if there's a transmission project required elsewhere for a regional reliability consideration, we help pay for that. So to the degree that we reduce that, we help all Vermonters reduce our price tag overall.
Thanks, Representative Stebbins. So there was a comment and then a question early in the chat that a number of fuel dealers have testified in opposition to the Affordable Heat Act, and wondering why we can't just achieve emissions reductions just with funding, with a carrot-based approach, rather than setting requirements for emissions reduction in addition to voluntary incentives. Do either of you want to talk about that kind of policy push and pull and the balance between carrots and sticks in terms of incentives and policy and regulatory requirements?
Yeah, I mean, we need both. I mean, if you just do carrots, you got to find where you're going to get the money to buy the carrot seeds or what, however the metaphor is gets stretched there. It's and that's basically what we're doing now. You know, we find some federal money. We had the Clean Energy Development Fund for a while. We were doing other things. We required utilities to do things. So that's kind of what we're doing now. So if you're happy with the way things are now, then you would say we don't need anything else. But I think for many Vermonters, at least that I hear from, they want to do more. They want to get off fossil fuel. And I know I can't read all the thing in chat, but I see a lot of the things about biomass and concerns about those emissions. But the real problem is fossil fuels. So to me, we have to have the regulatory scheme to really kind of basically break our addiction of fossil fuels. And it's going to take some time, and it's going to take both carrots and sticks and tambourines, as some people say, of cheering people along to say, this is going to be the best thing for us economically and environmentally in the long run. And that's why I support using wood as a transition off fossil fuels. You could, if you do just look at the carbon, you can make an argument that we should just be burning oil and we shouldn't switch to wood. But there are some buildings that means we're going to be running oil for the next 20 years. And it's the same with some of the wood electricity that we have, is that means the coal plant in Bow, New Hampshire is going to run longer, because on those peak times, we need that power. I think we shouldn't be building any new ones, and the goal should be to shut them down. But I think we got to shut down the coal plants and the oil plants first. And we have to make it to where people can't buy oil, even if they wanted to. So right now it's getting almost, you can still buy coal, and there are still people that heat with coal in Vermont. But it's getting more and more difficult to find a coal supplier. And I've talked to coal suppliers in the last 5 years that have gone out of business because there's no business. I'm getting out of the coal business. But there's still people that sell it. And I want to get there with oil. And so that's why I think coal or wood is a way to do that. And I think to really get to the point where, we're using all clean, renewable, local energy, we need to have both the carrots and the whole regulatory scheme to do it, which will take a very long time, but that should be our goal.
And there are often proposals, well, why don't you do this instead of this, or this instead of that? And one of the comments here is about lowering the speed limit. And there has been a bill proposed and put on the Transportation Committee's wall year after year after year about that. We could lower the speed limit, whether or not there would be the workers to enforce that, whether or not we would enforce that. I started off with the remark about what we're seeing in terms of compliance, in terms of how we, or whether or not we build our new homes to building energy code. One of the things that I see happen in the State House is if there's a sense that, sure, we could pass that bill, but it wouldn't be enforced and no one would follow it, there is a sense that then perhaps we should not pass that law. I'm not saying that that's not a good idea. And in fact, in Quebec, one of the policies that they have in place, one of their climate policies that has had a huge impact in terms of reducing emissions, was to put regulators into all trucks, all large, not passenger trucks, but transportation trucks, a regulator so that the truck could not go over a certain speed limit. And what this did was make it impossible for truck drivers to actually compete against each other to try and get to their end location more quickly than other truck drivers. It sort of leveled the playing field. I would imagine we would not get very far with trying to require regulators, either, because of interstate commerce issues and whatnot. My point here is there are a whole bunch of things that, frankly, I would love to do. I would imagine Senator Perchilik would love to do, which is why sometimes I draft bills and I'm the only one who's sponsoring them because I just would like to see that. But I know that there may not be the will or the desire by the other 180 people in the building, as well as the administration, as well as everybody else. So.
Thank you, Representative Stebbens. I just want to know on the question about emissions from biomass and wood heating, there was some comments about Energy Action Network taking a position on that or accounting in a certain way. I want to be clear, we do not do that accounting or have a position on it. In our report, we report on the state's inventory in the way that the state officially tracks it. So there is a effort underway in the Climate Council and with the Agency of Natural Resources to do a supplemental life cycle analysis emissions assessment that could be a supplement to the existing inventory, in which some of the questions about how to assess emissions from biomass on a life cycle basis will be addressed. But I want to be clear that what you see in the Energy Action Network annual report is the emissions data from the Agency of Natural Resources based on the methodology that the state of Vermont has adopted and utilizes. So just an important clarification there. There was a question in the chat for you, Representative Stebbens, and I think it's a really broad question about, you know, when we think about reducing emissions, there are ways to change how we use energy using, you know, one fuel versus another or one technology versus another. And then there's ways to just reduce energy consumption, use less energy, often, you know, through weatherization or conservation of. And so when you look out across the landscape, and there's all of these different kind of options for how we reduce emissions, different fuels, different technologies, energy conservation. What do you see as the most kind of like, how do you assess those different opportunities and the role that policy should play, you know, in terms of trying to address that in a priority order type of way?
Well, that's an easy one, Jared. First of all, I would say, I mean, if the question is to me personally, I would probably do different things if I was, you know, the governor of Vermont and had my say over 1/3 of government. There are parts to, if the question is like, how does one figure out which policy or which bill might move through the State House? Is that sort of the question, or is it policy writ large?
Yeah, I think it's more like what I heard in that question was there's so many different ways to reduce emissions and things that are proposed. How do you sort through that in terms of what should move in a policy direction? Like, what are your criteria as a policymaker of what you want to advance? Like when you think of, you know, yeah, this could reduce emissions, but does it also do X, Y, or Z?
Yeah.
Like, how do you think about it?
For me, I tend to look at which policies will have both the greatest reduction in emissions, and also will help Vermonters not be left behind. I am very, very concerned that for all of the criticism of the Affordable Heat Act, I don't hear other people proposing what we should be doing otherwise. You know, when folks say it's too expensive, let's put that in context, which is in November 2021, I think it was a gallon of oil or propane was like $3.50. In November of 2022, it was $5.50. So these prices are escalating. And as a policymaker, I don't think it's okay to say, okay, we're not going to do anything, but we know prices are going to keep escalating, because that's what we've seen since 1950. So for me, part of it, a big part is how do we balance what things are costing to Vermonters, and how do we make it affordable for Vermonters? Frankly, the folks who have plenty of resources are going to shift away from high priced, volatile priced fuels. They will, because they can. The folks who want a Tesla storage system in their garage with their EV, they will get that. It's the other folks that, without having a policy in place, you're not going to make sure that they can just simply make ends meet. So part of it is affordability. Part of it is where's the biggest bang for our buck in terms of making an impact in emissions reduction. And I really also repeatedly look at where is the win-win-win in terms of, there are so many, like I started off at the beginning, opportunities for really good paying jobs that don't require 4 or 6 years of, ultimately 150K in debt for higher education. Really good paying jobs. I was interviewing an electrician the other day, and he didn't go to college. He owns his own business, has 30 employees, makes over 200K a year, and this is possible. This is what Vermont can do, and there are so many. Vermonters have one of the highest high school graduation rates, but one of the lowest rates in terms of then choosing to go to college. So where are all those folks going? Where are their job opportunities? Do they know about these opportunities in the skilled trades? And how do we make that really something that ultimately helps save money, save energy, and grows Vermont's economy in a local way? So those are sort of the 3 parts that I tend to look at. Also, finally, what is I am not an island unto myself out of 180 people, plus all of the contract lobbyists and paid lobbyists and advocates. What is likely to move? Where is there support from others, other reps, other senators? And that goes back to how long some of these things take. Sometimes it takes 8 to 10 years for something to pass, because it requires that much energy and momentum to convince people to take the risk that a policy might appear to be offering.
Thanks,
One point on that whenever a group asks me to talk about the legislative process and how a bill becomes a law, I have my PowerPoint is how a bill dies, because that's real. It's easy to kill a bill. So like, I think as Gabrielle said earlier, there's like 600 bills. Sometimes there's between 500 and 750 bills introduced, and very few of them get passed. So shooting down ideas is the easy part, and trying to build the coalition and reaching the compromise, even though the Democrats have what people call a supermajority. That is, you still need everybody to vote, and it's a very diverse group within the Democratic caucus. So it's not just like, oh, the Democrats are going to do this, so that's going to be easy. You still have to work with everybody to get something through.
Thank you both. So I'm seeing a note from Michelle in the chat that we have time for one more question. And I just want to note that there's a lot of comments in the chat. I have taken the approach of wanting to ask questions of our panelists, but of course, folks who want to see comments and questions and criticisms, they can see that in the chat. But I want to end with a question that was just asked by Debbie New, and that is, given that the Vermont legislature is part-time and seasonal, as you were speaking about, Representative Stebbens, what is one thing that Vermonters can do to support our legislators in passing effective clean energy and climate bills?
Well, I think as we found this last election, getting out and voting and getting other people to vote is important, because we saw a lot of people campaign against candidates that were supporting the clean heat standard or that had voted for it across the state. And people that care about climate came out and voted for those people, and they did very well in the election, even though despite being attacked of saying they voted for a carbon tax and they were just going to raise people's prices on their fuel. So we need to keep that kind of support at the ballot box. And I think, engaging with folks, with their legislators, is a good way to support them. If, doing so in a way that's helpful, kind of like of course you should always contact your legislature and tell them just when you don't like things, but if you want to support them, even if you disagree with them, find a constructive way of engaging with them to make it better is a good way to support them. Because we get a lot of just people saying, you're dumb, don't do that. But that's even if you think that, if the question is how do you be supportive, even if you think we're doing something dumb, find a constructive way to do it.
Representative Stebbens, anything that you would like to add to that?
I think Senator Perchilik's comments, constructive, constructive comments, and just recognizing that these are not either or black and white simple conversations. And I think that oftentimes the narrative becomes exceedingly simplified. So it is a citizen legislature. So there is also an opportunity to run if any of you are interested in doing so.
So Michelle, thank you for reminding us about that final question before closing remarks. Is there, I'm happy to turn it back over to you at this point, if that's the appropriate way forward.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would just give a thanks for Senator and the representative for being with us tonight, and you, Jared, and for having this important conversation. It's obviously really important to a lot of people in this state and in the world. So we really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you being here and being in conversation with us. And thank you for all for being with us this evening, the League of Women Voters, for organizing this speaker series, and everyone who came to watch. Thank you so much and have a good night.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.